We come to the 42nd presentation in this year of the series Parayana, the way across, the way beyond the planet, the way beyond the star system. 42 is a wisdom number at one of the watershed reference waves in civilization. And the author that established that was Enneduanna, the daughter of Sargon the Great of Akkad, the founder of the Fertile Crescent and the expansion of his realm from Cyprus to the Indus River 4,400 years ago. His daughter Enneduanna was of the greatest wisdom in her time. And she is the first world author whose name we know, whose works we still have, and we have in many copies, because she was what we think of Homer as the archetypal epic in civilization, Western civilization. Enneduanna predates him by 1,400 years. She wrote 42 temple hymns to be the context within which to recast the Inanna myth. And she did both of these in her lifetime, and they were kept literally in print by copying out of the cuneiform for about 1,500 years. She was the textbook resource for the way in which one had a pattern of learning, a scheme of memorizing, so that one was able to preserve the ability to not only read and thus write comprehensively in depth, but to be able to distribute and pace your reading, so that the 42 temple hymns became a paradigm, as the word is now, for the way in which learning and memory distribute themselves, so that there is a creative insight into this. The motive for her was that her father was uniting 42 separate Sumerian cities out of the ages old, ages being more than 2,000 years of ancient Sumeria, their city-states, and each one had their own version of mythologies and own temples and own temple structure. And so there were always these vying, competitive kingdoms, and by the time of Sargon there were 42 different in a patchwork way. And it was through Enneduanna that she wrote a temple hymn for each of these 42 temple hierarchies of priesthoods, of ritual comportment, and brought them into a matrix within which the diagonal was a lightning, jagged quality of illumination of the way in which Inanna was also at the same time, in one chiral way, the great lover of love, inviting the way in which a feminine wisdom of love was able to protect and make radiant this quality of human beings. And at the same time, the other chiral as a great protectress. One, the goddess of love, and the other, the goddess of war, protectress, that life should be protected, so that the love sharing had its protection and nurture. And this was the inner quality of heartfulness and the outer quality of being able to structure a society symbolically through vision that was affine in a complementary way to nature. That ritual left to just nature had become tied to not just the natural way of developing ritual, but the symbolic, skewed way of a mentality that increasingly veered off and brought the ritual with it into variations, 42 of them in Samaria at the time. And all of this could be brought into a huge transform. And so 42 became the quality of a matrix of poetic that visionarily made an art out of the hymns that now became poetic as odes. And 42 is the number of odes of Mary Magdalene's Odes of Solomon. And later on, 42 became a template that was divided into 3 sets of 14. The 3 sets of 14 go back to the Gospel according to Matthew, where the lineage from Abraham to Jesus is traced in 3 sets of 14 generations. 14 generations between Abraham and King David, 14 generations between Solomon and the taking away, the exile, and 14 generations from the exile to Jesus. And when you look at the details of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus in his life was the 13th generation, and after his resurrection then became the 14th generation, not only bringing the 3rd, 14th to fruition, but to bringing the entire matrix of the 42 to perfection. 14 is the number of contemplation of the Holy Mystery poems by Ibn Arabi, written sometime in the middle of the early 1200s, and is an indication that by that time there was a great visionary re-understanding of remembering, of relearning, that completely transformed what before had been considered an Islamic empire into an expansion that included the incredible qualities of the mystical dimensions that were not corrallable as an empire, that were not just limited to a latest only prophet, but was distributed throughout a whole complex phased lineage. The way in which Ibn Arabi came to this was a vision. He was, as a young man, studying under one of the great teachers at the time, very, very wise, and whose books are still in print. He's known in the West as Averroes, and in Arabic, Ibn Rushd. His vision was that he saw that Moses, remembering Abraham, was very similar to Jesus remembering Moses, remembering Abraham, and that Muhammad was similar in the sense of remembering Jesus, who was remembering Moses, who was remembering Abraham, so that there was a sequence of spheres within spheres, wheels within wheels. And in the book of Ezekiel, in his vision about 540 BC, about 1,700 years, 1,600 years before Ibn Arabi, Ezekiel saw wheels within wheels way up in the air. And there have been, since the 1960s, 70s, books on the esoteric meaning in Ezekiel that he saw flying saucers. That in his vision, he saw what was the core of alien vessels surveying and trying not to contact, but really not trying to hide at all at that time. And later on, this became, in a couple of hundred years, the tradition of Enoch, in the book of Enoch, of 200 angels who had rebelled against God in heaven and who became fallen angels who desired to covet for themselves the daughters of men that they found comely, and had progeny who then, as Philo of Alexandria put it, they became giants. And Philo's book of Giants is related to that. They dwarfed the capacities of ordinary men. But one thing that they did not have the dimension of vision. And because they did not have the dimension of vision, they did not have the art of the jeweled person. And because of that, they did not have the ability to develop the whole qualities of history as the basis of science emerging, so that the arts and the sciences with vision and history were able to be a field and a complex flow, yielding the works of art and then the works of science, which had a great affinity for each other, and that all of this was not there for the giants, nor was it there for the fallen angels. It was up to divinely, mystically creative man who had been gifted with the ability for language to be not only heard and spoken, but to be read and seen. We know now from complex scientific investigation over many centuries, over millennia actually, that the primordial quality of sensing is through the eye, even back into crustaceans. Crabs have eyes. It is a quality, but they do not have a sophisticated sense of hearing. In fact, it isn't until you come to Homo sapiens, that you find a sophistication of being able to detect something which is very understandable and yet so minutely important as the air pressure. Because while eyes are primordial, going back to Cambrian times geologically, ears that are sensitive to hearing, language that is spoken in an intelligent way, especially an intelligent way in which it can be then cross-indexed with seeing so that it can be written and read, because language that has been wisdom, that has been well heard and able to be written so that it is able to be read, is able then to be spoken, to lift off the page, which is the test of a poem. If you cannot lift the poem so written off the page into your voice and be heard, then the ecology of recognition does not occur in poetry, does not occur then in the art, shows that the vision is not operative as an access to it, that the history is bogus, that the science is suspect. And one is left with an increasingly regressed, limited mentality that no longer is able to have the transparent symbols that are, quote, the windows of the soul, able to look out and to see, to look out and to then write what you see so that it can be read, so that it can be read out, so that the entire ecology of consciousness is able to come into play and to draw out the accumulating poisons in an undrained, unirrigated, stagnant mentality. Science, 21st century. This is out of date now. It's 2007. There's a new edition that came out just this year in 2014. Translational Control in Biology and Medicine, published by the Cold Springs Harbor Press. And Cold Springs, of course, is the famous Long Island Research Institute that has been completely transformed by James D. Watson over the last 50-some years, 60 years almost. While Francis Crick, co-author of the original DNA double helix papers, remained Francis Crick, a raconteur. James D. Watson has proved to be an extraordinary, what I have called a hermetic American, like a Benjamin Franklin, has been able to bring into play transform after transform, so that one now has the ability. This is over 1,000 pages. They have more than 50 or 60 publications in like size on the scalar now of 21st century biology, microbiology, Chapter 18, Translational Control of Synaptic Plasticity and Learning and Memory. It is the neuronal connectiveness in its plasticity that allows for learning and for memory to occur, without which one has a devolution. One has remembering truncated as codified memory, and for learning, it becomes simply the mastering of the encoding. This is, unfortunately, the state of plunging into giganticism that has no consciousness, and is increasingly not only jailing others, but is jailed itself because it knows nothing else except prison life. We have here in the Parayana, in the 42nd presentation, another opportunity to have a node, the third of the 14 nodes, so that instead of just looking at it as a year long of 4 13-semester seminar qualities, that this is in fact a moment where one can realize that we are able to look in a wisdom way at a triple, a trident of Neptune himself, a triple of like thrice greatest, Hermes Trismegistus, to see that we are endeavoring not just to understand, but to learn. And not just to remember, but to fructify this mental structure, this structure of thought, by the fresh winds, by the fresh water, by the fresh love that brings new life. And this indeed has always been called a rebirth, and it has a quality of being able to bring back even from the dead. This quality is obviated by the misunderstanding of time. It is the misunderstanding of time that is the primordial snag, and it occurs in such a subtle way that it takes a fresh, original wisdom to be able to vision it, to be able to express it, to be able to make history happen so that the science is again accurate in the sense that it's analytic, collects together an accumulated penetration of vision so that it has this wonderful quality of a harmonic, and that the harmonic is able to have an analytic in science, in mathematics especially, and a harmonic in art, in music especially. And so it is this quality of music and mathematics that is a tunable pair of conscious dimensions, of conscious phases, because one looks to graph time in a written way. It graphs as an energy sine wave. One of the easiest ways to see this. This is a Dover reprint of the 1937 classic by Sir James Jeans, still in print because it doesn't go out of print. Science and Music. The energy wave, that sine wave, has phases. And each unit of it will have, in fact, 2 times 2, a pair of pairs, 4 phases. When one looks at the way in which Sir James Jeans by 1937 could understand this, he was given a boost up in 1911 by Arnold Schoenberg, who published a book, Theory of Harmony, which changed the way in which music was visioned, able to be composed, and moved from the ancient preference for an octave in the West, or by a pentade 5 in China, or by a variation of musical notations and nodes in India. The ragas have a famous 1/3 composability quality that man is able to hear, 60-some different modes, and only 22 of them are able to be transposed into composition so that you can have this kind of a complexity, but one has to understand that there's twice as much that can't be written, but you have to be able to hear it with the inner ear. But with Arnold Schoenberg, he figured out a 12-tone scalar, and that this opened the door eventually, later on, by the early 1920s, an understanding that this had opened the door, like the 1910-1911 atom that Lord Rutherford had drawn and was drawing in the genius of Niels Bohr as a young man. And by 1922, it was available for Bohr to pull ahead of almost everyone and to write about a new form of the atom, that it had a quality that one could now understand was leading to a complete revolution. So Arnold Schoenberg updated his theory of music in 1922 to go along with the pell-mell tidal wave of realization that consciousness in its streaming has more dimensions than anyone would have thought. And that vision has so much that is hidden that doesn't come out until the art expresses it, until the science is able to analyze it, and that the aesthetics of art and the analytics of science concour together consciously into a new scalar of not just who we are and what we're about, but it's who we really are and what we're really doing. This particular edition was refined by the University of California Press in Berkeley in 1978 to do the translation. They did the research, and by that time the historical research was able to discover in Schoenberg's works a great deal that had been written about it. And so this is a revision in 1978 of the third edition of 1922. And they still read books like Science and Music. And the quality of that particular sine wave is exactly the quality that one finds, and I've put it in the notes, the way in which Einstein was able to redo the entire quality of physics and mathematics. That particular sine wave had a quality where, as in the notes, one has the energy wave of electromagnetic energy. The red half circles are the domains of registry of the electric field. And the cursive, sinuous, rolling wave of 4 black lines is the magnetic field, how it registers in terms of the refined mathematics. It is this registry that gives us an indication that the electromagnetic waves have a very particular quality. The miracle year for quantum theory, in 1905, Einstein realized that the stability of the universe lies in the electric fields having a particality position. But at the very same time, they have a magnetic wave that remains a wave, so that the carrier of this pair is the photon that carries the electromagnetic energy. And that the photon is able, as a carrier of light, to index the way in which the universe becomes creative and thus memorable. That learning and memory are actually due to someone shedding light and being understood. The quality of this is apparent because if you go into, on the very next page, if you go into the way that the photon follows in the magneto complement to electromagnetism, when it reaches a crest, it is able, if there is enough energy coming into the photon, for the emission of an electron. So that it is the crest of the magneto complement of electromagnetic energy that creates free electrons in the universe. Without the ability to free electrons or to have free electrons, you do not have any transformation at all, ever, beginning with hydrogen. It is the freeing of electrons that is the quality that gives the trigger that one can now have a plasticity to the elements, to the atomic structure of elements in concert with the harmonic structuring creative capacity of wave forms. Wave forms, particle phenomena within a field of nature, which if it were not really a zero field, none of this would be able to register. And only registers because time as the first dimension has occurred, and because it is time that occurs instantly, because there's now an instantaneity, space blossoms out of that sap of time. And so it looks like space, because with its three dimensions, rather gorgeous because it shows the phenomena. It displays the waves. Where time becomes hidden in its originality deep within. Because its quality of occurrence is a gift spontaneously of the fertile zero field. And so temporality has an esoteric meaning beyond belief, beyond what a mental structure of codification can write or register or interpret. Thus, one has a quality of language. The fourth of the 14 mystical contemplation of the mysteries poems by Ibn Arabi. Number 4, contemplation of the light of intuition as the star of transcendence rises. The real made me contemplate the light of intuition as the star of transcendence rose, and he said to me, I hide myself in evidence and intuition from the people of Vales, and goes on from there. Let's take a little break. Let's come back to this 42nd presentation in the year of Parayana, the way across, the way beyond the planet into the star system, the way across the star system into the interstellar frontier. Coming right up. We closed with the opening of Ibn Arabi's Contemplation of the Holy Mysteries, 14 poems brought together in a form which is the upper third of two more 14s that would make a 42, and that the ancient 42 hymns of Ene Diwana, bringing the quality back with Mary Magdalene doing the 42 Odes of Solomon, and the Gospel of Matthew making the 42 generations from Abraham to David, Solomon, exile, return, Jesus, resurrection. All of these aspects are brought together in the program of the Learning Civilization. Ibn Arabi, his short classic Journey to the Lord of Power, is used in the 9th phase of the Learning Civilization, the self-study phase after the 8, 4 for first year, 4 for second year, and a 9th for your individual inquiry as moving beyond completion into your quality of engagement with the quest for a more perfect quality. We've been talking about how Einstein, in particular, in the early 20th century, by 1905, had come to appreciate and understand his own visionary field, that since a little boy had exceeded all of the druthers and conditions and preferences and all of the details of culture and society, ritual and comportment. One of the great biographies of him, published a few years ago, Walter Isaacson, who was the senior editor of Time for a number of years, who did his first excursion into exquisite, complex biography on Benjamin Franklin, included then this beautiful volume on Albert Einstein, and in order, a few years later, to give it a compliment, the second volume was a volume of illustrations like plates and also documents, so that the two volumes together, a biography in complex detail and a volume of plates plus pages, is the form that I have taken for the upcoming, very soon now, Jesus in Alexandria and Mary Magdalene, Our Origins of Shared Presence. The subtitle of Parayana is Our Shared Presence Carrier Wave. It is the time, form, energy in civilization which is differentially an double transform beyond the occurrence of time in a natural cycle. The universe is in that natural cycle. But all sentient beings, wherever in the universe, will have come through the travail, as it is, of the accumulated penetration through increasing, regressive, corrupting blockages to the delivery beyond and across into what is viable in terms, in dimensions, in phases of the real. One of the qualities that comes out of this is that just as in the physics, the math, the way in which the universe can be understood in terms of light, the photon able in its crests of magneto current, able to free electrons to bring the interchange of elements into new, not only new atoms, but new molecules, into new structures that develop and who have this grand integral cycle of nature which can be appreciated. But there is a beyond of a visionary light, and there is an across of a historical quality of the second transform. The first, a differential consciousness of vision. The second, a kaleidoscopic consciousness of history. So that civilization has something beyond culture. That is, it has the beginnings of another time form. Not only natural time, but now there is a new fifth dimension of vision, a kind of a magic, loose freely in the world, to be rarely discovered and even more rarely appreciated, which allows for a second time signature to come into play. And as it does, the field of vision, because it is infinite, is able to have a great complementarity with the field of nature as a zero field, because she is fertile and accepts that infinite field in love for life to have its quality of increasing its phase forms into a whole new complementarity, and that second transform, the history, makes it possible for that higher culture where there is the beginnings of art, the mystery of vision, to be able to have the dimension of differential consciousness, the maturity of the jeweled person, the art of the person, the art of becoming an artist, creative imagining. Ibn Arabi used the term imagal, the imaginal quality that is able to bring the charming lilt out of movement, out of time, into the dance, where the chirality of that movement becomes as sophisticated as it did in the lifetime of that 1200s, that 13th century, where a like visionary Rumi became, after his great differential transformation with Shamsi Tabrizi, stopped just being a professor, became a savant, matured again into that third quality of being able to have a whirling, swirling dervish, mevleve quality of dance where one never gets dizzy, because the pivot is not based on the balance of the inner ear. It is based upon the infinite scalar scope of hearing the music in its cosmic quality. Here, the mystery deepens. Here, consciousness heightens. And here, the very quality of space becomes fruitful in a way in which the blossoming harkens back and brings that third quality of time into play. That quality of time that history and science paired together are able to tune, whereby one inherits the freedom. It's hard to find a good phrase for it. Here in Los Angeles, some 60 years ago, when Aldous Huxley and Christopher Isherwood and Swami Prabhavananda were doing a translation of the major Upanishads out of Sanskrit, they called the English translation the breath of the eternal. This quality of kaleidoscopic consciousness is a third, after the second transform, a third quality where nature not only is magical with visual art, but is historical with science. All of this has a pivot about the time of Abraham having his vision of a promised land, and became a carrier wave of a very special type that had only been seen once before and was hardly remembered except for a mythological revisioning of it some 1,300, almost 1,400 years after Abraham was born. It became a carrier wave that for the first time became historical. The whole book of Genesis, the thumb of the Torah, that first book, Genesis, is the history of how Adam's creation as the original carrier wave man who learned to read and write from his wife Eve, who plucked the fruit of that tree and gave him to eat, as the translation runs. That 2,000 years later, from 4,000 BC to 2,000 BC, was a time form of another carrier wave. The written quality at that time came not from that branch of Abraham and Sarah, but came from Zarathustra. His wife's name was Havogi, and Havogi was the princess of a royal kingdom quite far from Zarathustra's homeland, which was in Central Asia, what is today Uzbekistan, around what is classically Samarkand. And he went to live with his wife's family in the center of that kingdom of the time, and that city today is known as Kabul in Afghanistan, which is, interestingly not enough, in this new carrier wave, again, 2,000 years later, of great consternation and struggle. This involves our new carrier wave, hearkening back in its great concourse to a previous carrier wave that had inherited the carrier wave of 2000 BC of Abraham and of Zarathustra. Well, Jesus was the 41st and then 42nd generation from Abraham. The first triple witnesses that understood and met the birth were three magi, three Zarathustrians who brought gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Not to adorn a prince, but to protect a family from certain death, and by counsel to the father Joseph to consult his visions in the night, not just dreams, but dreams raised to great dreams, raised again to visions of the future and of the real past, of the continuity. And the confluence of these complexities led to the flight to Egypt, just in time. All infants, 2 and under, were to be massacred by a jealous monarch Herod. And they were. They were all killed. 2 escaped. 1 to Egypt with the gifts of the 3 magi who were from Iran of today, who had been influenced by Zarathustra, renaissanced 500 BC in the Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great, carried on by his lineage, who had a renaissance of the classical Zarathustra as Zoroaster, who put all of the transforms in that renaissance into the paired form of astronomy and vision, called astrology classically, and alchemy in terms of the transformations of matter. And the carriers of that in the Renaissance were by that time called magi, not Zarathustrians. And the community were called Zoroastrians. In Zarathustra, there is a tripartite quality to the civilized humanity. There are what he calls the men of action, those who do things, men and women. Man generically is mankind, the doers, the shakers, those who make things happen. They are busy. They don't have the time to mature to a deep enough quality of presence to be able to hear the man of light, the man or woman who is the one who brings the new and brings it exclusively, uniquely, because it always starts with the spontaneous emergence of that one. The people of action cannot hear because they don't have the maturity of presence to be able to hear. They cannot see because they cannot hear. So there needs to be a median. This, Zarathustra says, is the community of friends. They are friends together. They can hear the man of light, and they can speak and show to the people of action. This is new. This is fresh. And because it is new, it has all the energy of time with it. And if you continue to do the old will be leached out from its dynamic. It will collapse from its space. And you will be dead. And you will die with it. So that the new is not a replacement of the old, it is a maturation of it. It is a fulfillment of all of the developments of a third kind of a wave. Not just the carrier wave in its referentiality, a reference wave, but pilot wave persons who are the real community of friends. They are friends across time. They're friends across space, across every kind of categorization. Not just race and creed and so forth. All of it. They are friends. They hear in their pilot wave multifacetedness, the scintillation that is the jewel that they are being lit. And together, they find ways to convey this to the people of action. This is what to do now. And so. Not by a plan, not by an encoding, but by freeing the electrons so that the new molecules can come into play, and from there the amino acids are able to bring new proteins into play, and by this the qualities of life not only evolve, but they accrue. That penetration of being able to be at home, one of the phrases I used to use, that kind of maturation originally is out of the sandbox onto the beach. But that second transform is off the beach into the ocean. This is Henri Corbin's great, who's a French savant, lived until 1978. Lived until the new edition of Schoenberg's harmonic analysis came out in Berkeley. The man of light in Iranian Sufism. His teacher, à la Française, was a savant. His name was Louis Massignon. And Louis Massignon was this beautiful quality of French savant who had the affinity and the taste and the appreciation for all kinds of mysteries and all kinds of ways of seeing, of recognizing what something was. Later in his life, he became a Gandhian and did a lot of work with Gandhi's Satyagraha, truth-holding revolution without violence, and Sarvodaya, a society based on Sarvo, service, Daya, all the people, service to all the people. That it works, and its working is that life and love are not only safe, but they are safe to be free. Louis Massignon, when he was in Ephesus on an errand in Turkey, went to the cave of the seven sleepers because it's mentioned in the Quran. It's the only mention in the Quran that also is mentioned in early Christian literature as well, and Jewish literature. And recognized spontaneously this great carved, not a coffin, but on the scale of a cenotaph, that had this curved cap, and that there were these huge swirls of energy rising up through that cenotaph into the swirl of the cap, and recognized this was the tomb of Mary Magdalene. I have a photograph of it. The 20th century architect, at the same time that Massignon was understanding this and expressing this to very small and yet very influential coterie of friends, one of the hearers of Massignon was the architect Le Corbusier. So when it came time, when Le Corbusier, because this is how Hermetic circles on the highest levels work, indeed they do, was given a commission to build a chapel. And that this chapel was to be for a convent for nuns who were concerned with the health of service to the world à la Française vision of things. And at Ronchamp, he built his chapel, and the roof of the chapel is exactly that capstone of Mary Magdalene's cenotaph in the cave of the seven sleepers. This is how learning and memory make a great chapter in translational control in biology and medicine. Other chapters, and they go on and on and on, and one can understand the first chapter, Origins and Principles of Translational Control. Proteins occupy a position high on the list of molecules, important for life processes. They account for a large fraction of biological macromolecules, about 44% of the human body. Dry weight, for example, they catalyze most of the reactions on which life depends. And they serve numerous structural, transport, regulatory, and other roles in all organisms. If you can hear it. Accordingly, a large proportion of the cell's resources is devoted to translation. The magnitude of this commitment can be appreciated in genetic, biochemical, and cell biological terms. Translation is a sophisticated process requiring extensive biological machinery, one way to gauge the amount of genetic information needed to assemble The protein synthetic machinery is to compile a parts list of essential proteins and RNAs. Analysis of the genomes of several microorganisms had converged on similar estimates. These organisms get by with about 130 genes for components of the translation machinery, including 90 protein coding genes. About 40 genes for ribosomal and transfer RNAs, and a somewhat larger number of genes are involved in eukaryotes which have more ribosomal proteins and initiatory factors. For example, discounting genes that are dispensable for growth in the laboratory, it can be calculated that 40% of the genes in a theoretical minimal cellular genome are devoted to translation apparatus, learning and memory. Just to have learning and memory, not learning and then memory, but just to have that facility. It's 40% of the genome of all living creatures, great and small. It is important to understand that at every carrier wave, every 2,000 years, there is an emphasis that the dynamic refreshes itself through a recalibration of time. And that recalibration of time takes place between the reference wave and then 350 years later the carrier wave. And the median of that 350 years is 175 years. So one looks to see that the previous carrier wave of 2,000 years ago is 0 BC, roughly. And the reference wave is 350 BC. And the median pivot of that would be 175 BC. What happened in 175 BC? The appearance of the teacher of righteousness founding the Sine community at Qumran. After 20 years of wandering and finding and understanding that they need to recalibrate time, and the classic of that recalibration in the early Essene Qumran community is the Book of Jubilees. You recognize, this is what your computer will show you. The Book of Jubilees, sometimes called the Lesser Genesis, is an ancient Jewish religious work of 50 chapters, considered canonical by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. It's extra canonical by the Greek Orthodox, the Roman Catholic, and the Protestants, but in Ethiopia, it's remembered that this was real. Two disciples prepared that. One was Philip, who was able to enlighten the caravan leader of Queen Candace of Ethiopia, and he received a baptism from Philip. And it was passed on to Philip's co-writers. There were three who, like a tripod instability, were given the assignment to write this up. One was Philip, a second was Thomas, and a third was Matthew. And while Thomas went to India with it, Matthew went to Ethiopia with it. Philip went to Ephesus with Mary Magdalene and the young St. John. So that it is something where one has to begin to understand. The teacher of righteousness was not an Essene, but founded that quality in keeping with a vision of Essenes at Qumran to be a complement to something which had been developed and founded before. And that something was in Alexandria. Because the teacher of righteousness was an Alexandrian Jew whose father, that generation, were the translators of the Bible into Greek, the Septuagint, brought there by Ptolemy Philadelphus, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, to complete the sacred books of the world in the great library at Alexandria, and being a son of that generation that had translated the Septuagint, whatever visionary works they had became incorporated in the Septuagint, and later on were accepted because they were very early in that codification before there was a Hebrew Bible codified and accepted. And so they joined. And one of the earliest books was the book of Enoch. But earlier than it, almost by a generation, was the book of Job, which was the first book of the teacher of righteousness. His last book was the book of Daniel, written about 162 BC in Alexandria. And the main north-south boulevard in Alexandria still carries the name, Nebi Daniel. It's the street of the author of Daniel. More next week.